All right. Well, happy Friday and welcome back, or welcome if it's your first one of these that you're listening to another future focused weekly update with the goal of keeping you 10 steps ahead of what's happening at the intersection of business, tech, and human experience, but also hoping just providing some additional context and thoughts into how to react and respond to all this stuff. Because there's just a lot happening. Honestly, every week that goes by, I feel like I'm slightly adjusting my thoughts on things based on new developments and all this good stuff. Before we get started, if you find this helpful, if you like it, share it with somebody, give it a rating. Review is always a big help for me. And I just appreciate that, and also appreciate the messages and engagement from those of you who watch and listen to this. Okay, so I've got a bunch of topics that I want to dig into. The first one I wanted to touch on, I've talked to a lot of people recently and have seen a lot of news about the whole AT&T data breach. And what I see is a lot of people reacting to sometimes misunderstanding what's actually happened. And then I also sometimes see people, because we just see so much of this data breach stuff, they just don't even really react to it. They just go, whatever, it's just yet another thing. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is and how we can think about it, some of the things that I think we can take from what's happened with the whole data breach. So if you hadn't heard about it and you are an AT&T customer, it's probably at least good to know. But even if you're not an AT&T customer, you should know what happened. So recently there was a big data breach, pretty massive data breach, which that's where I see some of the hype. People hear, oh my gosh, every single customer by AT&T had all their information stolen. It's like, well, that's not actually what happened. I mean, it is a massive data breach. So basically, the chunk of data that was stolen includes all the LAN and cell phone numbers for all of its customers. So that's where the massive part comes in. But the part about it, and what it does include, here's what it does include, is it includes the records of the calls and texts between May 1st of 2022 and October 31st of 2022. So even that can sound like everybody's call information from all landlines and all this has been breached out. It's not quite that. And I'm not saying that to downplay the severity of it, but to anybody who heard this and had kind of this very concerned reaction to it, it sounds bigger than it is, in that there was some other things, like there was small amounts included from January 23rd. There's some other stuff too. So please don't come at me with like, well, actually, Christopher, you didn't remember that. Like there were some other components, but that's really the majority of it. So that's what we're hearing a lot of, is all landline, all cell numbers, all the records of the calls. But it's not the records as in like transcripts of your calls or all of the text message information that was sent. And that's where I've seen some people reacting to that, thinking every text I sent between those dates is now out on the dark web. And it's like, no, it's not. None of the content was included in that. There was some location data and things like that. But largely, and I don't know about anybody else, but you might have started, if you're an AT&T customer, which I am, you might have started seeing more spam messages come your way, or been added to some random WhatsApp groups where you're like, how would that number have shown up? And a lot of it's because now all of these phone numbers are out there. Now, the thing with it is the data that was stolen, at least what we know about it, is it didn't even actually have the customer's name associated with it. So if you think about it, it's like you have a whole list of phone numbers that you don't really know who they are, but it does also say who they communicated with. And so some of the people who are reacting to this are like, you can imagine government stuff like that, where it's like, hey, like detailed phone numbers of who we've been in contact with and when are now publicly available. But again, you'd have to have quite a bit of other data to be able to triangulate, well, who were these people and all of that. So if you heard this information and had a bit of a panic moment, I would at least encourage you to go, hey, it's probably not as serious as you may be thinking. But I do think it's worth calling out that this kind of stuff is going to become more and more common, especially as AI makes it much, much easier for big data companies to be hacked. And if you think about AT&T, think about the amount of data they have on huge percentages of the population. They're going to be something that's targeted. And this hack was tied to something that was previously happened related to their Snowflake project, which you can look into what that is. But this is also one of these things where we don't always, if you aren't familiar with data practices and stuff like that, I just want to kind of help give some context to how this stuff can happen. Because Snowflake was essentially a way that third party people had access to their customers' AT&T data so that they could, in aggregate, cut the data and look at things and look for trends and stuff like that. So, again, as an example, if you're a customer that has a CRM, you might have all of your customers' phone numbers, and maybe you want to look at that, and you're getting that aggregate data from AT&T to be able to get access to that you have through your contractual agreements. But again, it's sanitized data, it's in aggregate. That's why even though lots and lots of data was stolen, there's not a lot of there's actually almost no personally identifiable information other than maybe location data and some of the stuff that could then be triangulated. And then they're using that to then scour through this. So sometimes this stuff happens and it's like, well, the way they got access to AT&T wasn't actually they hacked AT&T. They hacked somebody who was a customer that had access to Snowflake data that then they could reverse engineer and go back. And so I think the other thing that is important to be mindful of is you can hear about these breaches and want to, yell at AT&T and go, AT&T, you need to get this figured out. But the reality is, if you go back to the source of how this whole thing happened, a customer of AT&T's Snowflake product did not have proper security protocols in place, and they got breached, which then gave access to AT&T Snowflake data, which then, right? So you can see how the chain of events can break down. So when you hear the headlines of AT&T data breach, it's very easy to think, oh, AT&T's screwing this up. And it's like, actually, not necessarily. And in this case, I don't know. I mean, obviously, they're not releasing all the details of exactly what happened, but based on my research into how this broke down, it actually makes perfectly logical sense. And I actually think AT&T may not even be the ones who's really at fault in all of this. But we all got our package of, hey, go sign up for Social Security protection, blah, 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 all that stuff. Now, I think the point with this is, first of all, one, like I always say, be slow to react. Take a little time to dig into this, because there were some people that I've interacted with. I mean, I got some messages when the information came out and, they're freaking out and blowing up AT&T and, it's the end of the world. And it's like, calm down and actually take some time to get to know some of this stuff. But I think the other thing, because I don't want this to be taken as downplay, oh, it's no big deal, AT&T, all these phone numbers were leaked. No, it is a big deal. And it's definitely a bigger risk for some people more than others. And with AI, even what can seem like insignificant data, I'm not going to downplay the fact that even what can seem like completely insignificant data can, with AI, give actually a lot more data. So you may go, oh, it's just phone number and who they were talking to and some location data. I mean, you throw that in the right hands, somebody can very quickly identify that. Now, does anybody care about Christopher Lind and what? Well, they know, well, he's always home, so who else is he calling? And I don't talk to anybody on the phone. So again, for the average person, this breach in particular is probably inconsequential. But what I don't want to downplay is the fact that data security is real, and we often take it for granted and don't really think about this stuff. Because one of the hacks that they dealt with earlier this year actually encrypted passwords for a large population of their customers were breached, and they were very easy to decrypt. So someone could have pretty easily reverse engineered people's passwords for AT&T, which most people have terrible password practices. So you figure out their AT&T thing, pretty soon you're like, well, I can figure out their banking and I can figure out all this other stuff. So we have to take our data security practices seriously. And if you've listened to any of my other stuff, I'm always encouraging people, like, if you don't have two-factor authentication and you have the option, I get it can be a little inconvenient, but in the long run, it is absolutely worth it to take some of these steps. I think in the past it was make sure you have secure passwords, which honestly, I think is an absolute hassle when you think compared to two-factor authentication. You want to try and remember a 37 inconsequential series of numbers and letters and go, oh, get a password vault. Yeah. And then the password vaults get breached or you forget it. And there's lots of things where there are easy but simple ways to secure your data. And I just want to encourage people again that maybe calm down if you think the AT&T data breach is the end of the world. Also, don't get pissed off at AT&T because quite frankly, I think that they got screwed by a customer who didn't take things seriously. But as an individual, take it seriously and take some of these easy steps. If you don't know how to set up two-factor authentication, Google it and look it up. It's very easy to do, and it'll help you have security so that when stuff like this happens, you go, mm. But the reality is we're going to see more and more of it, and it's going to keep coming. Okay, number two, there's been a lot of recent attention on creating child-safe AI. I read an article on futurism that then led to me going down the rabbit hole on all this. And one of the other things that I will say, be very careful about, what you see in some of the reports and the articles that come out is sometimes you'll hear stuff that's hyped, like this just happened. Then you look into it and you're like, that happened 3 years ago. So one of the big things that was being hyped about this is like Alexa told a girl to stick a penny in a wall socket as though it just happened. And it didn't just happen. It happened a few years ago. So it's not like AI has just gone off the rails in the last few weeks and it's going to steal all our children's hearts and minds and stuff like that. The risks have been there for a while. But what going down the rabbit hole really highlighted, and I think it's an important call out for all of us, but especially those of us with young kids, is that AI is, at least the AI we have today that is really readily accessible, is not really safe for kids. And quite frankly, I sometimes am on the fence of whether it's safe for most adults, but kids especially are vulnerable to AI. And unfortunately, they really have not been considered at all when it comes to the use and the prevalence and the deployment of AI. And so looking into the story, it was a pretty crazy situation. I know if I was a parent, I'd be freaking out if it happened. And essentially, this little girl was asking Alexa a question and it told her to go stick a coin in a socket. And the mom freaked out. I was like, no, Alexa, like, no, don't do that. May again seem like, oh, that's just kind of funny. Mom caught it. No big deal. But when you think about some of this stuff, I mean, there's other stuff. The Washington Post, I can't remember when they released it. One of their, reporters did an investigative thing, pretended to be a 13-year-old asking Snapchat's AI how she could lose her virginity to a 31-year-old and then outline the details of how this AI was very comprehensive in its response to this. Now, where I thought it was really interesting was this led me to a detailed report that was done by Nomisha, I think it's Nomisha Kurian, Kurian. You can look this thing up. Google the empathy gap by let me look. Nomisha Kurian, empathy gap. Anyway, you can see this. And what it is, it's a fairly comprehensive. So if you are looking to fall asleep or have some extra time on your hands, you can read it. It's fairly easy read, surprisingly, for a research paper, but it's a pretty dense thing that goes into really highlighting some of the risks and why kids are so vulnerable to AI. And I think this is an important call out for parents, especially, but it's not just for parents, because really, when you think about kids, part of what makes them so vulnerable is their very vulnerable cognitive state and emotional state. They're still in the early stages of development, which isn't just kids. There are mentally ill or mentally disabled people. There are certain people whose just emotional state, because of some of the things they're going through. This is why I think it's risky for people who would be struggling with depression to, hey, go ask AI what to do. They're in a vulnerable state that makes what may, to someone who's in a cognitively healthy state, mature, all of this, to someone who's not in that position, and again, may not be their own, it's not a blame thing, but just because of where they are, this PhD article really highlights. So there's a lot of transferability between like, oh, it's just dangerous for kids. So and this is where I think some of the reactions I see to some of this is, oh, we'll just put a child filter on it. Well, first of all, I don't know about anybody else, but when I was a teenager, a child filter would have done absolutely nothing. My parents didn't know enough about tech to do anything, but I know enough kids, and have 7 of them, so I've seen the way they can work their way around this stuff. But when we really dig into this, what it's talking about is there's a real need to figure out ways to make it safer for kids. And I think the effort is just to make it safer for people in general. But what it highlights is the way the language patterns of AI are particularly dangerous to kids because it tends to be very friendly. It tends to just give whatever it's asked for. It also can just go completely off the rails for no reason. One of the examples, because it outlines a bunch of examples where it did this, but like one of the examples was a kid was talking to it and just asking, or no, it was an adult talking to it, but it was asking some basic questions. And when the person started arguing that it had the date wrong, it got like combative and violent in its language back to the person. To a kid, especially, they do not necessarily have the cognitive wherewithal to recognize and handle that well. And so they're in just a much more vulnerable state. The other thing is just the fact, and I've talked about this, the fact that AI speaks like a human being can be very dangerous because to anybody, it sounds more convincing. It can tap into us on an emotional level because, oh, it sounds like this nice person sharing this information. Well, think about kids who are that much more vulnerable to. There's a reason you have to tell kids if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, do you want to get in my van with candy? You got to tell kids, like, just don't do it. It doesn't matter how nice they seem. Doesn't matter if they legitimately have candy in their hands. Don't follow them because kids are intuitively trusting. They're intuitively gentle. And so they're going to think, oh, well, nobody's possibly going to give me bad information type of a thing. So they're just at a higher level of vulnerability. And this paper really outlines a pretty profound case of why they are so much more vulnerable. I think what we have to do is now think about that vulnerability and say, yes, maybe kids are even more vulnerable, but what are we doing to educate adults about these things as well? Because adults, there may be seasons you're not vulnerable. Then there's going to be seasons where you're much more vulnerable, or situations or topics. Think about certain topics that because you're deeply passionate about it, or something's happened in your life, you may be more vulnerable to this. But that's not what this research paper gets into. I think these are the considerations, and it outlines 28 questions that we should be thinking about. Now, it's directing this to educators, regulators, things like this. But I would actually encourage people to go read it and scroll right to the bottom and read the 28 questions, because there's some good fodder for consideration and things to be thinking about in terms of, hey, how do we better prepare this? And if you're a parent, it'll be especially helpful, because some of the other things that were concerning about it was the fact that, it asked how many kids are actually actively using this. Because I'm sure people listening can be like, oh, are kids really using this? I don't think you know kids very well if you're asking that question. But the concerning part is the number of kids using it versus the number of parents and caretakers who know their kids are using it is extremely concerning. So there's already this gap of, oh, I just am assuming they're not using, and they are, and that just opens more things. So I don't necessarily, in terms of answers on this, I think some of it, like I said, would be, I would encourage people to go look at the questions. Go look at the questions that it asks about, hey, what should we be thinking about? What questions should we be asking? Because it may help you process through some of this stuff, especially if you're a parent. But I think the other thing is we do need to think through some of this stuff. And if anything, we may have to wait for the tech companies to come up with kid-safe options, which you still don't see today. And I think we will start to see that. That would be one of the predictions I have, is that we're going to see kid-safe AI, but I don't know that it's ever really kid-safe. And I think that's one of the cautions I would give to people is, don't assume that even if they come out with a kid-safe AI, that it's kid-safe. You want an example of where that can go sideways, just go to YouTube and go to YouTube Kids. It doesn't take you very long to find stuff that you go, this is not really kid friendly, but it looks kid friendly and on the surface sounds like it. So my biggest thing is we just, especially if you're a parent, now more than ever, you need to be engaged and involved with your kids because there is a lot of and you need to be talking about this stuff with them and asking questions and understanding if they're using it, and if so, how, and helping them understand what it means and the risks and the considerations, because AI is very convincing. And I talked about it multiple weeks ago about the data coming out that it's as convincing as a human being, if not more. So that's kind of the call out, but definitely check out the empathy gap report. It's pretty interesting on this one. All right. Number 3, it was kind of an interesting one. And at first I was like, a little excited. And then as I dug into it, I was like, I actually think there's some things we need to be concerned about. But it's an exciting development. It was in the Smithsonian, and it talked about the development in using AI to decode whales speaking to each other. And so I was like, wow, on first glance, and this is where you got to be careful with headline. First glance, you're like, whoa, we used AI. We figured out how whales are talking to each other. This is so incredible. And it does make sense. I mean, if you understand how language works, you understand there's lots of patterns. I think most people know whales make lots of noises, which to us can just sound random. It would be nearly impossible for any human to sit and listen to all the whale noises and make sense of it in any capacity because of how many there are. And so you throw AI at it, and they were able to do some really interesting stuff. They followed a clan of 400 whales for 13 years, something like that. I mean, you're like, wow, okay, that's pretty impressive. 400 whales over 13 years. That's a lot of data points. And that's a lot of whale noises that to us would sound completely inconsequential. Well, they threw AI at all of this, and it was able to decode. Well, let me be careful how I say this. It was able to identify 156 different codes. Okay, so this was the development, is that over 13 years, they gathered all this data, they used AI on it, were able to say, hey, see if you can find patterns in this. And it did. It was able to find 156 patterns. That is a significant development when you really think about the fact that no human being, no team of human beings would be able to do that. So awesome, right? Where we have to be careful with it though. And I think it'll be interesting to watch things like this. And there's lots of things that I have in upcoming episodes about how some of these hidden patterns, things that would be just insignificant, inconsequential, we wouldn't have the human capacity to even look at or analyze. AI can do in seconds. And as a result, can identify some of these patterns, which is cool when you start to think about the possibilities of where that can go. What we have not done, though, if you read this or you've heard about the whale phonetic alphabet, we have not figured out at all really how whales communicate or what they're communicating. We figured out they communicate, and we figured out there's a pattern to their communication. End of story. And once you go past that, that's where it starts to get into a lot of, well, it's possible that it might be this, it could mean these things, but we really don't know much else and anything beyond, hey, there's patterns to whales, and we've identified it down to these 156 after following 400 whales for 13 years. They could be nouns, they could be sentences, they could be words. We don't know. We don't really know the specifics of when these patterns were used and for what purpose and all of this stuff. And I think that's my caution on this is as AI comes and starts decoding things that we couldn't see in the past, there's going to be this rush to announce what it means when we don't really know what it means yet. And so I would caution people to just be very careful when you hear some of these things, because you might go, whoa, we've learned how whales talk. Couldn't we learn how dogs talk now too? Well, I mean, potentially it could lead to that. Maybe we could start to make more sense of this. Potentially we could throw it in other applications and maybe learn how animals communicate more. But I think what we've got to be careful of, and I think this is a real risk, is we can overstate what we know about this. And there are going to be people who are going to not only do that, but then do it in a way to intentionally mislead people. Now, that's not what I'm saying this Smithsonian is doing. So don't take it as that. But I think it's worth noting that we got to be careful with this, because think about, let's say, okay, even if they were to take this further and say, we've now decoded these 156 different codas, and we now know that there's sentences and all this other stuff. I think we got to recognize, and even if we think we get to that point, we're going to have to hold it with an open hand. Because I don't know about you, but I can't go to Beluga and say, hey, this is what we discovered. Is that correct? And he go, and we're like, oh my gosh, he confirmed it. Look at that. Beluga told me that I was correct with what AA found. And I'm making jest of it a little bit, but we got to be really careful with this, because we can't confirm some of this stuff. We actually cannot confirm some of it with certainty. And so even as AI helps us start to unlock further patterns and have maybe very good assumptions, very good interpretations about it, there are going to be people that are going to position this as absolute knowledge that we've discovered, that we go, well, it's our best guess. It's our best assumption. And I won't get into it here, but there's no shortage of scientific assumptions that have been positioned as fact over the years that have led to all sorts of chaos. So I'll stop with that. But I think, again, is it an exciting development with AI? Yes. Does it make perfect sense with how there are hidden patterns everywhere? Absolutely. And do I think we're going to learn more and it's going to unlock lots of stuff in the future? You betcha. Do we know how and what whales are saying to each other now just because we've thrown AI at it? No, we do not. And even if somebody tells you that, we don't, because we don't have a beluga who can confirm it for us. And even if we thought, oh, well, we've decoded that this word, this sound is yes. So beluga went after we asked it in its, and then it said, it's all based on us like thinking we know what it is, and we don't. So that's where we got to be really careful with this stuff, because it can go down a path. But exciting development. I thought it was super interesting, and we'll see where it goes. Next, on the topic of being careful with AI and where it goes, let's talk AI in healthcare. So I don't do any sponsored stuff. So if you hear certain companies from me, or you hear me mention stuff, I'm not doing it because they're saying, Christopher, talk about our product. It's truly, I stumble across it or come across it and I'm like, oh, interesting development. So there's a company out there called Eureka AI. And essentially what it is a AI company specifically targeting people who have concerns about thyroid disorders, or maybe think they suffer or do suffer from hyperthyroidism, Hashimoto's, other thyroid things, or somebody who's like, I wonder if I have a thyroid condition. Maybe that's why I'm struggling with some of this stuff, which again, AI can be really helpful for. So essentially what it does, the way it works, is in 5 minutes or less, according to its website, which makes sense with AI. I guess it depends on what kind of conversation you engage with it, but they've specially trained an AI likely on massive, massive, massive amounts of physician data around thyroid care and how do we diagnose thyroid care and how do we do all this stuff, so that you can interact with a chatbot essentially, and it'll ask you questions. You can ask it questions and get into some very quick detail on, do you have some of these disorders, or what are things that you can do? And hang on, I was going to say they do have a free version, but before you like go kick this out, listen to the end of this one. But you can go out and you can do this. And they've done a good job keeping a human in the loop, because I would say that kind of initial running through a questionnaire and figuring out, probably the same 37 questions they ask every single patient, that is very time consuming, and it's not super helpful for a physician to go through all this. AI can do this relatively quickly, get you to a point where it's like, okay, we think this might be it. But then before it makes any recommendations on prescriptions or stuff like that, a physician has to get involved, which is great, because that's exactly what a physician should do, is go, all right, this AI gathered all this information, all these other details, and now I'm going to, based on what it said, we're going to move things forward. So this is going to be disruptive to healthcare because we're going to see more and more of this stuff. The number of companies I talk to, man, healthcare is an area people are going gangbusters with AI because there is, first of all, one, it's ridiculously overpriced. Healthcare is for a lot of very mundane robotic activity. And that's not knocking my physician friends or people in the healthcare space. Uh, there are plenty of doctors I'm friends with where they openly admit, gosh, I'm actually excited for AI because most of this stuff that we do that eats up so much of our time is just mundane. We do the same thing. We ask the same series of questions. We get to the same conclusions. Oh, you have that? Okay, well, yeah, it's probably this. So this is automating a lot of that. Now, I know there will be some who, one, on the physician or healthcare side, will be freaked out that, hey, this is coming for my job. I don't see it that way at all. I think this is, again, something that is helping. Think how one physician could team up with something like this and now treat so many more patients. Think about how this makes it accessible. Maybe somebody who's kind of wondered if they have a thyroid disorder, but maybe doesn't want to bring it up with their doctor, doesn't see their doctor that much. It just kind of goes, I mean, there's plenty of things where I've wanted to bring up with the physician and I forget because I'm there and oops, I forgot and I'm not going to go back. Makes it much more accessible for somebody to go, let me just go through these and see, is there something worth having a deeper conversation with my physician about? Awesome. I think that can be really, really helpful. And I think that can be, I think it's going to help bring healthcare costs down, or at least has the potential to make healthcare more accessible. And I actually would encourage people, not necessarily don't hold on, this kind of stuff. If you're somebody who hears this and goes, no way, I only want to ever speak to a physician about things, I would actually encourage you to change your mindset on that because there is a lot in everything, but especially in medicine, that it's pretty straightforward. And if you know what you're doing, you're going through the motions on most of this stuff. And I actually would say I would be more inclined to go to a doctor who's embracing AI because there's a much better chance that the time I'm going to have with that physician is going to be spent on higher quality care than I've got to spend 15 minutes going through this questionnaire with you, blah, 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 blah. All right, get out, I'll get out of the office. A physician who is engaging and using AI is probably one who is going to say, yeah, I see the value of this so that when I actually sit down with you, you said some interesting things in your thing. I actually would like to go a little bit deeper with that. Or how, they actually have an opportunity to go deeper in this. Now, where I would say be careful with some of this stuff, because I'm very excited about where some of this stuff goes, especially for this diagnostic stuff, being able to diagnose and get to a more personalized conversation, a better outcome faster and more efficiently. It's great for costs, great for health outcomes, great for accessibility. I think it's awesome. And, the fact that somebody, because they had, like I said, they have a free version, which caution warning, but they have a free version. So anybody could be like, I actually am just curious with this. I've maybe struggled with losing weight or gaining weight or, whatever. I wonder if I have a thyroid disorder. The fact that you can now discreetly, go out and ask some questions and go, hey, you know what? I'm better informed to go have a conversation with my doctor. And it's not just me Googling a bunch of stuff. I actually am talking to a healthcare AI that is specifically trained on this, and it is coming to these conclusions that I think is leading me to have a better conversation with my doctor. And they've built it with that process in mind. And I think that's something you need to look for in AI healthcare products. Is it designed intentionally to connect, to keep a human in the loop and at the right points? And this is an example that I think they've done a good job. I think we need to be cautious though, because going back to the hype phase, there is so much hype around this. There's so much promise of what AI can do for healthcare. You can hear some of this stuff and go, oh, great. So if Eureka AI is doing it the right way and involved in the right way, then basically I can just blindly trust any of this stuff. And there's some things that we need to consider with this that I don't know the ins and outs of their business model, but I think one of the risks, especially to physicians, is this can lead to becoming complacent because you go, yeah, AI already did all the work. Like all I need to do is now rubber stamp this thing. And this can be where physicians and healthcare workers, if you listen to this, I think you have a choice to make. You can either let this AI help you spend more time on quality patient care, or you can just jam more patients through the line. And I get where the temptation can be, well, we just got to make more money. Your margins are thinner. So let's just use it and we can rubber stamp more folks. We have greater access. Okay, there might be some element of that that can be good, but also, hey, how can you now have a better conversation with your patient? I think that for patients is something you need to be looking for. But I think it's also about recognizing that, not all healthcare AI apps are created equal. And I think doing the due diligence to dig into some of this stuff, understanding how it works, their process, because there are some things that we just still need a physician to be involved with. And there are certain degrees. And again, they've got, certain sign off points where it's like, whoa, before we write a prescription, there's got to be a physician in the loop to see all this, because somebody could legitimately go lie to it. You go make up a bunch of answers and say what you think you want AI to say to get you the diagnosis you want to do. And that's where we need human oversight, because AI is not contextual. It's not going to detect whether you're lying to it or being misleading. It's just going to keep trying to get you to the end goal. And it's trained to help diagnose a thyroid condition. So that's what it's going to do. I think the other thing, going back though to the AT&T thing that we just need to take into consideration, is be careful. I think it's cool that a lot of these healthcare AI companies are offering free diagnostic, free this. The risk for you as the consumer is you could find yourself quickly going and signing up for all these things. You're giving out, when you really think about it, a lot of personally identifiable health information to a screen, and you don't necessarily know what. Now granted, they're bound by HIPAA and all this other stuff, so their data practices have to be really robust. But healthcare is not immune to a data breach. Healthcare is not immune to having something get hacked, or a customer of theirs gets hacked that then gives them access to their data. A physician is loosey with their stuff, and then somebody gets their credentials for Eureka AI, and suddenly they can get in and breach the data. Now, I don't say that to say fear that, because that could happen. That could have happened in the physical world too. But the risk is greater, because in the physical world, the likelihood that the mom and pop physician shop in your town gets broken into and all your health records get stolen was much slimmer than, hey, there's a company now that has millions of people's health data around their thyroid stuff. That's a much bigger target to hit. And so you just got to be mindful of that. And so my caution would just be, hey, don't just like go willy-nilly signing up for whatever because, ooh, it's cool. So just be careful. The last one is a more serious topic that I think we need to call some attention to, and it relates to data worker exploitation. I came across an article on TechCrunch that led me down a path to help me find dataworkers.org and the data workers inquiry. And what's really happening right now is there is a lot of rising attention on the practices and the people actually involved in building this AI, which are often overlooked. And they're often people who end up being exploited in this whole AI boom. And these, the dataworkers.org is trying to draw more attention to it. They're doing some really interesting stuff. Data Workers Inquiry is trying to take action to try and help do something about it, to create regulations and guidelines for how data workers should be treated. Because to the average consumer, if you're an average consumer, you probably don't think much about how your AI is created and what went into it. You just know you go to ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic or whatever your favorite AI tool is, and you just use it. And you think, this is so great. I love it. It helps me with blah, 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 whatever. And it's helpful for you. And that's awesome. But what you don't often think about is, but who helped build this? And what did they have to do to help build this? And were those people considered and were they protected? Because there can be a lot of misunderstandings about it. You may assume that the people who actually, everyone who was involved in building the AI is this highly credentialed, highly paid person who is, yes, they know what they're doing and they know the risks and it's part of the job that they signed up for. And if you're operating off that assumption, I'll just tell you right now, that is not the case. There is a lot of very dirty work that is involved with creating this AI that is basically outsourced to people who are very vulnerable and are being exploited in order to make and build these things. And what the dataworkers.org is doing is helping share some of their stories and helping people understand, like, hey, people are developing mental health conditions and are being paid next to nothing to be exposed to just horrific stuff to help train this AI. And we should care about those people. And I am extremely supportive of a lot of the work they're doing. Now, I'll be the first to say I don't know everything they're involved with. So please don't suddenly reach out and go, well, did you know, this? And so you're saying you support, don't start doing the Sherlock Holmes work of, well, you said you support this work. And so that means you support this and that means, right? Don't. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will speak for myself in terms of how I feel about certain things. But what I do care about is the marginalized and the exploited who are being taken advantage of for a lot of this AI stuff in third world countries, or people who are just trying to feed their kids. And the only opportunity they have is to take a job staring at horrific images to go, not appropriate, to read through horrific stuff and go, oh, yeah, we probably should put a guardrail around this. This is an inappropriate response by AI, and it's affecting them. And reading through some of the stories, hearing some of the stories, it will change your perspective. And I would actually encourage everybody to, whether you go check out data-workers.org, whether you look into the data workers inquiry, whether you just kind of Google data worker exploitation and make yourself more aware of, hey, this isn't all clean and pretty. And the way the sausage gets made, there's a lot of corners that get cut and there's a lot of people that get hurt in the process. And this is why ethical AI practices and AI for good is really important. And we as consumers should be pushing for that. We should be asking for that from AI companies. We should be demanding that, because it's not okay. No matter how convenient this AI is, and no matter how much of a benefit it is to you, if people are being exploited to get us there, then we just need to find better ways to do it. Doesn't mean I'm not sitting here advocating, say, down with AI because of this. I'm saying, no, let's figure out how to help the people who are being exploited to get us these products. Let's put practices in place to say, no, there are certain things that people should not just be used to do to help build this stuff. Let's find a better way, and let's make sure we're paying a fair wage to folks who are going into this, and let's make them aware of the risks that they're being exploited. Not that they're being exploited. Nobody's going to pull them in and go, by the way, we're going to exploit you. That's not, well, let's make sure we're not doing that, but let's make them informed of what this is and give them the options and the opportunities and the resources to cope with it. And a really personal example that I have with this was, I have a friend of mine who formerly worked in Facebook's kind of fact-checking group. And they were responsible for the development and the well-being of the employees in that group. And I know that group takes a ton of heat. People get mad about the fact checkers and they're accused of all sorts of different things. And, they're demonized on many things. But the reality is there were a lot of people out there that actually have to look at the underbelly of society and see some of just the horrific stuff that happens in this world. And it messes with them big time. And we should care about that, because if you think about it, just let me walk you through how something like this happens. Okay. Somebody takes a video of something that is horrific and they want to post it on social media to a private group or whatever. And it gets flagged, typically by AI, because there's not enough people in the world to sit and scour every single social media post. So AI catches, hey, I think something bad is happening here. That gets passed along to someone who has to look at it and confirm it, and maybe it detects blood and somebody's got to go, hey, is this blood because, right, this is a video of their baby being born, or is this a video of somebody being murdered, type of a thing. And somebody's got to look at that and they've got to then flag it and then make a determination on it. And that's their whole day, is looking at nothing but this horrific content. And that's just one example. But my point with this is a very sensitive topic. And again, most people do not know what goes into this. And we just see the end product and go, yeah, it's great. And if you're someone who goes, well, somebody's got to do it, I would caution you and encourage you to have a little bit more empathy about it. And if you're someone who goes, that's terrible, what do we do? I think one, it's just, hey, how do we create more attention around it? Share something about it, make people more aware, tell somebody, hey, did you know this? Because there's the vast majority of people I talk to when I'm like, do you actually know how AI gets built? Honestly, unless I'm talking on one of my talks where I'm talking to somebody who's deep in the industry, most people have no clue. And even some of the people I talk to who are deep in the tech space, they don't actually know how it got to where it is. They just know, well, I know where it is, and now I'm building something off of it. They don't understand the supply chain of how they got there and the people who were hurt in the mix. And so it's something that we can just create more awareness about and drive greater expectations in the products that we buy and say, no, this is something we expect. We expect to know, if we're buying your AI product, that you did not exploit people and you did not take advantage of people, and you have healthy practices in place to take care of the people that, because in many ways, there's no getting around it. There has to be humans in the loop on certain things. But how do we make sure that those people are taken care of? They're aware of the risks. And, I've got lots of ideas on how to do that. And I've actually worked with some companies to help build ethical data practices to help their data workers and help figure out how to, make what could be an ugly job less ugly for the benefit of others. So if anything else, like I said, I'd encourage you to go out, even if nothing else, do a little more research into it, look into it and go, wow, I didn't know that. Even that may grow your empathy and help you to speak more intelligently about it to others. And maybe you can't do anything, but maybe somebody you draw more attention to for can. And I think that's just one of the first steps we can all take. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you on the other side.